Hello, everyone. Welcome to the series Mud Talks, Water Quality and Intersection of Science and Law with Anya Kwan, Class of 17. My name is Vanessa Chu, Assistant Director in the Office of Alumni and Parent Relations. We thank you for attending today's event. This talk is being recorded and will be distributed after the event. Please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat, and we will try to get through as many questions as possible. Now, I'm going to turn it over to our speaker to introduce herself. Anya, the floor is yours.
Hello, my name is Anya Kwan. I am the class of 2017. I was a chemistry major, and after going to MUD, I attended law school where I focused on environmental law. And now I kind of do water quality work. And so this presentation is going to focus on that and the importance of having scientists in law and kind of what you can do beyond the scope of just like a patent, which is the typical trajectory for scientists who then go to law school. So with that, I'm going to start my presentation. To begin, I want to make it very clear that I'm not intending to give any legal advice. This is just an informational session. If you would like legal advice, please reach out to me directly afterwards. I have my email in the presentation, but this is just informational, and so I just want to make that very clear. The other thing that I want to briefly mention is that in the blurb I had written about this presentation, I had mentioned that I was going to be discussing both PFAS, the per and poly-fluorinated alkyl substances, and bacteria issues. Because of kind of like how the law has been changing with regards to PFAS, I decided to kind of focus this presentation only on PFAS. With that said, if you have any bacteria questions, feel free to ask them in the chat as we go along, and I will do my best to answer them. So here's kind of like how I'm going to go through this presentation. I'm going to just first describe what PFAS is and how it's being defined and some of the issues relating to it. Then I'm going to look into and discuss the health advisory limits in the drinking water standards. So basically how much PFAS various forms of government are deciding we can consume through drinking water. And then I'm going to look at like liability framework through CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, and the proposed rule that they are attempting to implement at this time, and then once you kind of understand the framework of the rule, I'm going to explain the technical concerns about the proposed rule and kind of bridge that into why it's so important to have scientists in law, especially with regards to regulation, environmental research, and things like that, simply because there are not a lot of lawyers who kind of bridge that gap, even in the environmental world. So first question is, what is PFAS? Many of you may have some kind of idea what PFAS is, but in terms of regulation, that definition is a little bit more ambiguous. So under federal law, it depends on the agency. Even within agencies, it's not typically set in stone what that definition is. So for example, the contaminant candidate list for drinking water defines PFAS as provided below. For those of you who are not familiar with organic chemistry, the R is considered a carbon group with various compounds elements attached to it. The C is carbon, the F is fluorine. So it's important to note that one of the things that defines a PFAS compound is it has to have that fluorine element within it. And the fluorine under the federal standard, the federal drinking water standard under the federal drinking water standard, there has to be 2 carbons that are considered fully fluorinated in order for that to be considered a PFAS compound. This is pretty contrary to many of the other states. I believe at this point it's 15 states that have a different definition of PFAS, and that's any compound that contains a fully fluorinated carbon atom. So again, I have shown what those kind of examples would be. So the big difference is that the California and many of the state standards are much broader, and so more compounds are encompassed in that PFAS definition than it is encompassed under the federal regulation. And the reason why that matters is because the cleanup standards, the restrictions, and things like that under the federal standards will only apply the federal definition, but within California, you would still have to apply and use the more restrictive standard. Interesting to note the difference between these two defined terms on how PFAS is defined result in a federal standard that encompasses about 9,000 compounds, while a California standard encompasses about 12,000 compounds. So that's kind of just interesting to note in terms of scale and what's included. So the PFAS properties that have made it so ubiquitous is that it is heat resistant, grease, oil, water resistant, corrosive resistant, stain resistant. Basically, it has a lot of desirable properties that are used in a variety of industry. So for example, PFAS is used in like PPE for firefighting material, rain gear, non-stick pans, water-resistant makeup, food packaging, Post-its, Sharpies, most adhesives all contain PFAS. The other thing is that it's used in a lot of like manufacturing processes. So for example, it's used in semiconductor etching, and it's part of like electrical wire insulation. So it's everywhere at this point. And avoiding, apologies for my cat, avoiding PFAS at this point is very difficult and almost impossible. Yeah. So now that you understand kind of like what PFAS does for people and like the and how it's defined, here I'm going to provide a little information about the technical specifications. So the limit of detection for PFAS compounds is about 4 parts per trillion. As I described before, there's thousands of PFAS compounds, so the limit of detection changes depending on what the compound is, and not all PFAS have a known limit of detection. As I kind of gave you estimates on how much of each, like how many PFAS were encompassed in each definition, but even those aren't exact numbers or known because how PFAS breaks down, it changes the number of then PFAS compounds that are then included in the class. The health impacts of PFAS also depend on how you are exposed to PFAS. So depending on whether it's in the air, it's just in your bloodstream or in water, it's how long it lasts there. So then therefore the impacts of it are different. So for example, if you have PFAS in water, which is a lot of what I deal with and I'm familiar with, it can kind of stay in the system because like once it goes through groundwater and is pumped to drink, so that lifespan is really long. So then it provides it lots of opportunity, for lack of a better term, to then become like consumed or used by people, or then spread, in different areas, since like most groundwater aquifers are connected. So the fact that there's lots of different compounds and they're used ubiquitously and they don't have like a standard way of measuring or determining what the like the technical specifications are different, it makes it really difficult to monitor, to regulate, and kind of ensure that there are health safety standards for people. One of the big issues that the EPA, both federally and in California, is considering is how to classify PFAS and how to regulate it. So there's 2 main ways to do that. And first is to think about it as a class, and the other is to regulate it as individual compounds. So as a class, it's easier to regulate, but the issue is it's how do you break up these 9,000 or 12,000 compounds into a class of smaller classes that then you can regulate more easily. People are proposing, based on structure and things like that. However, because each PFAS compound has a different structure and all the structural elements change physical properties of the PFAS, this makes it really difficult to then maintain and perform a cleanup standard. And so the class system, although easier to regulate, creates issues on the implementation side. On the other hand, you have the, regulating individual compounds as individual PFAS compounds. But as I said, there's up to potentially even more than 12,000 PFAS compounds, and creating standards for each one of those compounds is going to take a very long time and is arguably not feasible. So in that sense, we're having the EPA in general is having issues determining how we should classify and regulate these compounds. Currently, they've been focusing on pretty much on 4 main compounds and working and dealing with that to begin with. And then the kind of idea is they'll figure out whether or not they should look at individual compounds or as a class later on in once those initial regulations have begun. So the 4 compounds that the federal EPA has really started with is PFOA, PFOS, PPBS, and Gen X compounds. They are spelled out on the slide. So it's interesting to note that these are the 4 lifetime exposure limits in drinking water. So that's important to note that it's in drinking water, which means this takes into consideration any PFAS consumption using other methods, notably skin contact, like using PPE or a raincoat or whatever, and also PFAS consumption through food. So if you're unaware, it's on a lot of wrappers for food compounds when they're provided to you in hot little container things. So the PFOA and the PFOS drinking water health advisory limits are interim. They haven't been finalized at this point, but these are kind of the standards that people are starting to work off of, and the other 2 are finalized. So it's important to note in the health advisory limits that these are below, for PFOA and PFOS in particular, are below the limit of detection. As I provided before, the limit of detection for PFOA and PFOS is about 4 parts per trillion, but these standards are 2-3 orders of magnitude below that, which is going to make cleanup standards nearly impossible at the federal level. The other thing that's interesting to consider is that these standards are changing. Right. So, for example, in 2016, the standard for PFOA and PFOS is a combined standard of lifetime advisory of 70 parts per trillion. As you can tell, the 70 parts per trillion is substantially higher than 0.004 and 0.02 that are now the new interim standards for these chemicals. So California has its own drinking water standards. Most of these were created when the EPA standard was 70 parts per trillion, so they were considerably lower than the federal standard when they were implemented. Given that the new EPA standard came out earlier this year, California hasn't really had a chance to respond yet, and as such, they're a little bit outdated, but it is possible that they would come down at some point. So here we have the notification levels and the response levels. So the notification levels are where you have to tell a consumer that, hey, there's PFAS in the water and PFOA, these specific ones. The response is when they need to do something about it. So as you can tell, these are much, much higher than the new EPA standards, and wouldn't satisfy that at all. So it's interesting. So you see, it's interesting to note that these standards have changed some, but they're typically more stringent than that from the EPA. The Gen X here, just as a note, California seems to be a little bit more hesitant to regulate them because they're supposed to be the replacement for PFOA and PFOS in order to be better for the environment. So as a result, they are not currently regulating it as stringently and are kind of waiting to see what the EPA does on those compounds. I also just wanted to flag that they have announced a new standard for perfluorohexane sulfonic acid, which is 20 parts per trillion and 3 parts per trillion for the response and notification requirements as So now that I've talked about these standards and what they are, I'm going to try to discuss like why they matter. And the main reason currently that these health advisory limits are important is through the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. So that's CERCLA. I will only refer to it as CERCLA from now on. So CERCLA you may have heard of as the Superfund law, which requires anyone that is considered a polluter, a discharger, a transporter of a particular compound to be liable for the movement of that compound. Those compounds have to be defined as hazardous waste. Most of the time, Congress is the one that defines what hazardous waste is, but in this instance, Congress has not acted and defined PFAS in a way that allows the EPA to move under CERCLA. It's interesting to note that one of the reasons why Congress hasn't acted to define PFAS under CERCLA is that they're not sure how to define it. Although there's a big push in some states to, use that broader definition, Congress, given the partisan nature, has not been able to nail down a definition. So hence why the EPA is stepping in and designating as a hazardous waste under CERCLA. With that said, under CERCLA, they have not created a definition for PFAS, and so it's going to be a little bit hairy for a while, and we'll kind of have to see on how those compounds are considered when they move beyond the PFOA and PFOS. So currently under CERCLA, the new law would only regulate PFOA and PFOS. They're doing it one compound at a time in order to really understand how the cleanup standards will be implemented and what kind of the rules will be. So under CERCLA, the current owners, operators, any former owners and operators, arrangers, generators, transporters are all liable for the movement of PFOA and PFOS. So as you can imagine, that will be lots and lots of people considering that, or organizations considering that PFOA and PFOS are in pretty much everything ranging from rain gear to nonstick pans to Post-its, Sharpies, etc. So that's kind of like the context, the regulatory framework that currently exists for PFOA and PFOS. The health advisory limits are relevant to the CERCLA designation because the cleanup standard for water, especially, will be those health advisory limits. So as I've stated before, those health advisory limits are below the limit of detection, which creates this issue of how do you actually know that something's cleaned up? So I kind of jumped ahead on the last slide, but the new rule under CERCLA would be to add PFOA and PFOS and their salts and isomers to the hazardous substance list under CERCLA. Under CERCLA, you're liable for any amount that is released, but there's no reporting requirement unless there's more than 1 pound in 24 hours. As you can imagine, a lot of the if PFAS is not in a liquid, is in liquid form and is mixed, that 1 pound reporting quantity becomes interesting and not necessarily the best way to do have a reporting requirement for hazardous waste. So as I've alluded to, there are a number of technical concerns about the proposed rule. As I stated before, the cleanup levels are typically based on the health advisory limits. And there are issues with the health advisory limits as that they are below the limit of detection. Beyond that, they are also being challenged in court by a number of industry groups, and just simply because they are not feasible to meet at this time. So the other thing that's an issue with the CERCLA designation is that the proposals coming before the Science and Cleanup Technology is fully developed. As I've stated, first of all, we don't even know how many compounds there are. And so the fact that they're opening the doors up using PFOA and PFOS will create issues if they continue to add compounds and haven't set that definition of what compounds are going to be subjected to this rule. The other main concern is that there's currently no agreement on disposal or destruction techniques. So, for example, the EPA typically allowed burning and like deep well injection, basically, where you just dump the PFAS very deep into, like pump it very deep into the ground and let it sit there, or you put it in landfills. But they were told by Congress not to burn it anymore. And so now there's only the remaining two mechanisms for just getting rid of the PFAS. And those two methods are the ones that were used the least. So as a result, we can't, there's more PFAS that needs to be disposed than we can actually dispose of. So there's this issue that even if we could clean it up and fund the cleanup and to the standard that's required, how do we dispose it? So that's kind of problem one. There's been a lot of interesting research recently on how to destroy PFAS compounds. So I'm not sure if any of you are aware, but there was this interesting article that used a combination of lye and DMSO to kind of take off the acid portion and then remove all the fluorine compounds. With that said, it's really only been tested on a small scale, and a lot of these, you know, where we have PFAS, it's large quantities, and so that kind of method may not work, and it may be cost prohibitive. Those are kind of things that haven't been really discussed, that need to get discussed, that are going to create problems with this rule, simply because the cleanup technology isn't really where where it needs to be in order to actually implement these rules. So my point of this presentation is to try to convince more scientists to go to law school and do environmental work. Obviously, you won't probably make as much money as a patent lawyer, but I think it has good social ramifications. And as a attorney who practices in an environmental space, you're kind of, with that science degree, you're kind of put in a really special place where you can help create regulations. Regulations are typically compilated from kind of scientific journals. Someone reads them and decides, okay, you know, what should the new standard be? And as a person who really understands those articles, it's a lot easier to create regulation or suggest regulation that is more in line with what those journals state or articles state. As this kind of leads to my second point, where you can challenge standard practices that don't rely on scientific data. I have starting in the 60s, the EPA had this general practice, especially in bacteria, where they halved any standard that the scientists or like an article stated that was suggested and halved it just in case. So they introduced a whole nother level of like tolerance to that standard, which I would argue is not accurate or robust. And so as a result, I've been able to like challenge standards because they kind of still maintain that practice of having standards without explaining why they're having it. So that's just kind of something that, you know, being able to like read the research and then like look at the standard and understand why they're different or ask the correct questions. That's really an important skill that a lot of lawyers in the environmental space don't necessarily have, because they don't want reading the research is not something they're familiar with. The other thing you can do is facilitate communications between scientists, policymakers, and government entities. There are a lot of situations that I've been in where someone is trying to change units or hide units to make it seem like things are better or worse comparative to the standard. And so they like to, you know, just move units 3 on either direction so that the numbers look the same and there's no longer a problem, or there's a huge problem. And so being able to make sure that, like, you know, the policymakers and the government entities really understand like what they're looking at is really important, and not necessarily something that like other people pick up on immediately. The last thing that's really would be important to have more lawyers with a technical degree in environmental law is to really ensure the public understands the risk and ramifications of their actions. So for example, if any of you are from Southern California or a coastal area, I'm sure you've been told not to go in the water after it rains, the ocean after it rains, because the bacteria levels are high from the stormwater runoff in the channels. So although the bacteria levels are higher than typical, like when there's no rain, that risk is actually much smaller than you would think, based on the language that at least has been presented to me growing up. So for example, the risk of a GI illness or gastrointestinal illness after swimming in the ocean after it rains is 10 times less than flying in a plane pre-COVID without a mask. Nobody wore a mask flying in a plane prior to COVID. But for years, people have been telling you, don't swim in the ocean after it rains. And so it's really important to have scientists as lawyers and be able to pick out this information and then present it to the public so that they really can understand the risks and make those decisions themselves. That's it for my presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the question box.
Great, thank you, Anya. So we do have a few questions for you. Our first question, so related to the half-life, what do PFAS break down into, and are those compounds generally inert, or might they have problems of their own?
Sure, so PFAS often breaks down into more PFAS depending on the size of the compound. Some of them are inert and some of them have their own issues, but given the fact that they typically have that a fully fluorinated carbon compound, they are problematic, and they have many of the other issues that other PFAS compounds have.
Great, thank you. What are the effects of PFAS on human health, symptoms-wise?
So PFAS is typically considered a carcinogenic. So there's no direct impact to human health. It's just typically an increased risk of cancer. The type of PFAS actually changes the type of cancer that risk corresponds to. So that's kind of an interesting thing to note. The other thing is that a lot of the studies that have done this correspondence of cancer are done based on mice, and so it's not a perfect correlation, obviously, to people. But there is very clearly a relationship between PFAS and cancer, as shown by a lot of the firefighters who worked, who wear the PPE and then use the firefighting foam, which is a known PFAS carcinogen, and they have very elevated risks of cancer.
Great, thank you. Let's see, our next question. If PFAS levels are above the health advisory but below the limits of detection, would organizations be responsible be considered out of compliance and liable for paying fines if they cannot demonstrate they are below the LOD?
So if the concentration is below the LOD but above the health advisory limit, you could still be considered eligible for the fine or cleanup under CERCLA. You would have to be able to demonstrate that. So under CERCLA, if you move, transport, or just move, transport, own, control PFAS compounds at all at any concentration, you can be liable. So the health advisory limits are what the cleanup standard needs to be at. So basically, you're liable if there's any of it, but you only have to clean to the 0.04 parts or 0.004 parts per trillion for PFOA.
Got it. Thank you. Let's see. A lot of questions coming in. Given the low number of PFAS destruction technologies, wouldn't that support limiting the use of PFAS as an entire class rather than creating a harmful chemical that we then need to destroy?
Yes, but I would say it's not possible to completely stop using PFAS at this time.
How do federal or state regulatory agencies decide their thresholds for PFAS?
Sure. That's an interesting question. They go through, there's lots of research that's published about PFAS. And so when you publish in about PFAS or something like that, you basically get to submit your paper to the EPA and say, hey, you should consider this when you make your standard. And so the EPA relies a lot on those kind of publications that are then sent to the EPA. They also do some of their own searching more for international articles to figure out those standards, but they use that research to kind of create a baseline for how much information, for like what the standard should be and what information is needed, and they can kind of request additional research to be done so that they can kind of flesh out that standard. So currently all the interim standards are based on research that has been published within the last year. And so that's kind of why the interim standard was dropped from in 2016 the 70 parts per trillion to these really, really low numbers now.
Okay, thank you. Could we live comfortably without PFAS chemicals?
No. Let me explain. So PFAS is necessary for semiconductor etching. So that would play a huge role in how computers and all of that technology that I'm very unfamiliar with would go about. The other thing is it's a very common insulation and technique. So you would pretty much all electrical wires have it. We would be going back, probably at least 50, 60, 70 years in terms of technology, and in order to kind of live without PFAS at this time.
Got it. Thank you. From the perspectives of law and public awareness, where do you see the grand challenges in developing appropriate regulations for a group of chemicals as diverse in properties and toxicity as PFAS, given that we know so little about the overwhelming majority of such compounds?
Sure. I think one of the biggest public challenges is trying to make sure that people stay informed without making them overwhelmed or uninterested. So for example, we have Prop 65 in California, which requires that little cancer labeling on almost everything. And as a result of that, at least I and many people I know have just ignore it. Because it's on everything, you don't care. And so the biggest issue is yes, there's a lot of unknowns, but I think a bigger problem is how to make sure that the public isn't desensitized and is still able to respond adequately and appropriately as needed. That's, I think, going to be a big issue at some point. But that said, it's not happened now, and so it's kind of, we're in the more scare tactic zone.
Got it. Should we, as non-legal political folks, get involved in issues that typically is driven by policies? What areas would you recommend that we look at?
I would say, yes, it's always good to get involved. In terms of PFAS and getting involved, I'm not sure. Every time the EPA comes out with a new standard, they have to have a proposed public comment period where industry groups respond, or government agencies, things like that. But individuals are allowed to respond too. So if there is something you're really passionate about, that's probably a good way to make your voice heard. Or you can also look into organizations that have similar perspectives as you do, and then kind of, assist in that process of the comment letter. That's probably the easiest way to get involved with the PFAS issues. Beyond that, I'm not sure of other methods, but that's something to consider.
Great, thank you. Our next question, let's see, we talked about that. Can class standards be set based on the small starting list as EPA has done with, I'm going to butcher this, trihalomethanes mixtures in drinking water?
Yes, and they are considering doing the small groups. However, they've already found that the impacts of different PFAS compounds are pretty varied. And so as a result, it's a little bit more difficult to classify. Also, I don't recall what it was, but it's trimethyl. So they have a common structural group that's easier to kind of regulate and work around. So PFAS, you're looking all over the place. There's no consistency in length. There's no like they have, most of them have that carboxylic acid group, but a lot of beyond that, there's a lot of structural differences that are making it really difficult to regulate. So when you have differences in where and how things are attached with, if there's an oxygen or no oxygen, that kind of changes the properties substantially, and which is kind of the issue. So as I talked about before, PFAS is used to be water resistant, oil resistant, and grease resistant, right? So the same compounds aren't doing all of, like the one compound isn't doing all of those things. You have to use kind of a mixture. And so as a result, it's going to make it really difficult to separate them out.
Thank you. Let's see. So we have two questions. It's a 2-in-1 question, I guess. So the first question, you mentioned that Congress has acted to implement a new rule in CERCLA that would regulate PFAS, but one of the slides said that the EPA administrator has the power to do that. How does this work?
I'll answer that one first. So CERCLA has two ways of working. One, the EPA administrator can create the rule and then implement it, or two, Congress can decide what's hazardous, and then the EPA has to implement that. And so with PFAS, the EPA administrator is doing it. Typically, Congress is the one that decides when something's hazardous. As a kind of interesting side note is PFOA and PFOS, it's the first time that the EPA administrator is deciding that something is hazardous. Typically, like every other time, Congress has made that determination.
Thank you. So second part, what's your role in challenging standards? Are there laws governing them that let you sue to change a bad standard? Or does the entity that sets the standard have to ask for a scientifically trained lawyer's help?
Yeah, so as I've kind of discussed, there's a public comment period prior to any standard being implemented. And so my role is drafting comment letters, typically to, either the EPA or the water board, describing why I don't think the standard is good or why the standard should be modified. You can sue to challenge those standards, but it's based on, I'm trying not to go into a rabbit hole. Sorry, you have to show that it's an arbitrary and capricious ruling. That's, if you're interested, the case is Chevron, it's a Chevron deference standard is what it's called. And so basically you have to prove that their standard is irrational. And that's kind of how you overturn it, but there's no really other way to do that. Because the standard is, like, if it makes sense, you don't need a scientifically trained lawyer to do that. You have to just show that they didn't perform the proper procedures. So for example, under this new CERCLA rule, there's been already talks of, challenging the PFOA and the PFOS standard. And the reasons for doing that would be the Office of OMB, I'm not really sure what they stand for, but anyways, Management and Business, I think, they told the EPA that they should do a full cost analysis, and the EPA chose not to. So for example, that component could be considered like an arbitrary, oh, thank you, whoever wrote that. So because they didn't complete that would then implicate that it would be arbitrary and capricious. And so therefore that standard could be overturned based on something like that. So it's more of a procedural issue.
Thank you. And just to clarify, OMB is Office of Management and Budget. Thank you to our audience.
Yes.
Next question, what can we do to work more upstream and educate chemists about the potential toxicity of the chemicals they are inventing?
That's a great question. I haven't thought about it. I think maybe to consider like application and kind of the use case of it and see how how it could impact other areas. I'm not really sure how one creates a new chemical, so I feel like that's one of my own personal lack of knowledge, so I don't really know how to answer that question. But maybe more extensive testing before it gets released. But beyond that, I have no idea. But yeah, great question.
Thank you. So can you tell us a little bit about how you decided you were interested in going to law school, like what sparked that, and then of course the process of it? I have a few students who are interested in learning about that.
Sure. So I went to law school because, so here, a little bit background on myself. I was a flavor chemist. So I did, my thesis at MUD was on flavor chemistry and nano-encapsulation of an orange oil flavor. So on my breaks, I worked at a flavor lab. And there at the flavor lab, I made a mustard flavor in the fume hood after, pouring it in a bottle and just pulling out the empty beaker. All of my skin on my hands under my gloves started burning. My face was burning, crying. I ended up passing out. When I woke up, they told me that one of the compounds, isoamyl-thiocyanate, was a mustard gas derivative and I needed to rinse it out. And so the fact that a compound like that was allowed by the FDA kind of sparked my interest in law school. And I actually went back and applied to law, took the LSAT 6 weeks later, which if you're thinking about law school, do not do. Make sure you study the whole 12 weeks or whatever they recommend. So that's kind of how I fell into law school. What was the second part of that question?
I guess, one of the questions that's in the Q&A is, did you also need to pass the bar exam in the state where you're working?
Yes, you do. It's a little bit interesting with federal law because there's no United States bar exam. So as long as you're barred in California or whatever state you work in, you're able to do federal work. With that established, you have to basically just pay a fee to the particular court that you're working in federal court. So for example, California has 4 different federal courts and you have to pay a fee to practice under each one. Some of the states have bar exams that are transferable, but California does not.
Great, thank you. Another question that we have, what are the challenges involved when federal and local laws collide? What rights do Native Americans, indigenous people have that may supersede local or federal laws?
So federal law is kind of, your local rules cannot contradict federal law. Federal law kind of just wins. So it's kind of the structure of that. So you can make standards that are more rigid than the federal umbrella, but you can't make them less restrictive, if that makes sense. In terms of tribes, they have sovereign immunity, and so they have their own kind of sets of rights, and so it creates it brings a whole level of complexity when you have tribal lands. I've done some work regarding water quality with tribes, and so you have to because they're essentially on a more similar level to the federal government and generally above the state. It's kind of it's not quite as linear, if that makes sense.
Great, thank you. So we do have a few questions interested on how you chose Harvey Mudd and why you chose chemistry. Would you be able to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I chose chemistry because I liked it. It was my favorite subject in high school, and so I became a chemistry major. I think I wanted to do more on the food science side, and so that requires a pretty solid background in chemistry with some biology. I chose Mudd because I wanted to go to a small school. I'm originally from the LA area, and so I wanted to stay local. And Mudd was, one of the schools I was interested in. I applied to a couple of the other 5 Cs, but Mudd was the one that I felt had the best fit in terms of its thesis program and being able to get a lot of research as an undergrad, which is, I thought, important if I wanted to get a PhD.
And do you plan on aiming for a PhD eventually?
No. I've had enough school.
Got it. Thank you. Another question is, which branch of chemistry do you like the most and why?
Which branch of I don't food chemistry because it's tasty.
Great, thank you. Let's see, do I have any other questions? I think that is all the questions that I have at this point. Do you have anything else you'd like to add to say to our audience?
No, thanks for joining.
Awesome.
If you have any questions, feel free to reach out.
Perfect. Well, everyone, I want to thank Anya for joining us today and for sharing your knowledge and your insights with us. Thank you to our audience for your questions and for attending this event. We will follow up within the next week with a recorded video and any presentation materials. And of course, we will give you Anya's contact information in case you want to reach out to her. Up next, we have the science and fun of sourdough bread making with Jean Davis, parent of a student of 25, on Thursday, December 1st at 5 p.m. Pacific time. If you're interested in being a Mud Talk speaker, please contact us at alumni@hmc.edu. All future events can be found on our website, alumni.hmc.edu. Have a great night, everyone. See you next time.